Welcome to SQL Snacks, learning the features of SQL Server one byte at a time. Hi, I'm Bob Taylor, and I'm going to be your host for this series of SQL Server training short subjects. Welcome to today's SQL Snacks. We're going to focus on the extended event targets today. This is the way that we can persist the data that the extended events generate. As you can see, there's a large number that are for internal use only. I'm not going to drain this slide, but you can look those up. Most of them involve the SQL security audit events. The event stream, compressed history, and router are all truly internal. We'll take a look at the query to see what ones are available, and you'll find that as we go through different versions of SQL Server, more event targets are added. Here's the standard list as of SQL Server 2016. In SQL Server 2017, we added a new target type called service broker, but doesn't seem to be fully implemented. We'll talk about it later. But the ring buffer event file, event counter, histogram, pair matching, and ETW classic sync targets are all common targets that we're going to use. We're going to examine each one in turn, and we'll take a look in future SQL Snacks at how to parse that event data. All the event data is in fact XML data. There is a UI in Management Studio, which we're going to cover in a future SQL Snacks. But today we will focus on using XML XQuery to parse the XML data to get the outputs that we desire. So the first one that we're going to look at, first target, is the ring buffer target. It's an in-memory target, very quick, uses very little memory. We're allowed to configure how much memory it uses when we configure it in the UI or via Transact-SQL. The nice thing is when you stop the session, the stored output's discarded. It's really just for quick and easy examination of data. Let's say you have a query that's running hot, using lots of memory, and you want to see if there's a sort or hash warning. You can quickly create that session in memory using the ring buffer target and then examine that for output. When you're done, you just turn it off and the output goes away. You can parse the data using XML queries, as I said, or you can view it in the UI in SQL Server Management Studio. The event file target is a little more complex in that you have to specify more parameters for the target, but it allows you to persist the data to an XEL extension file. You can have multiple files. They can roll over when they're full. In fact, this is the approach that the System Health extended event session uses. It persists 5 files and rolls them over periodically as they get full. We'll show you how to use the extended event file and how to read from it as we go through the SQL Snacks. Just note that in SQL Azure DB, because we do not have a direct OS file system to write to, there are some extra steps that we have to take. And we will have a SQL Snack on how to record XEL file targets to SQL Azure DB blob storage. When we go to read the file, obviously we have to have something that can read a file, so we use a system function called XEFileTargetReadFile. And basically there's 4 parameters. The first one is the most common parameter that you'll fill in. It's the path where XEL files are written. MD path is legacy. It's essentially a format file that 2008 and 2008 R2 needed. Today we just set it to null. Doesn't give us any benefit. The initial file name is, if we have specified a file name like sort and hash warning, it will be the basis of the file path, and then there'll be timestamps appended to the end of that. And then if we have a file, but we want to look maybe halfway through the file, we can give an offset, how many events we want to skip before we start reading the events out of the file. This is good as if you've read events from the file. Say you've read the first 1,000, you've processed them, you've done something with them. Now you want to skip those first 1,000 so you're not examining them again, and you can do that with the initial offset. So here's a sample of how we could do this. We are selecting the data from XE file target read file, in this case from the ctemp directory. You can see that we have a sample dash star. That allows us to read all of the files that match that wildcard pattern that are in that folder. So it's a nice, easy way to, if you set up file rollover, to read the entire set of files very quickly. The event counter target is an interesting one in that it just captures the number of times an event has occurred. It has no parameters, and unlike a lot of the other targets, this one does process synchronously. Just counting the fact that an event occurred is very lightweight, and so it doesn't really threaten the performance of your system to capture this one synchronously. But most other targets do capture asynchronously and periodically flush to their target so as to avoid that overhead on your server. The histogram target is a little fancier. It's kind of like the event counter, but it allows you to bucket. And in fact, in the early days, this was called a asynchronous bucketizer. I guess they figured that was too much of a mouthful and changed it to a histogram. So you set up a number of bins. It has to be a multiple of 2. So if you set up the parameter for slots to be 59, we would round that up to 64. So it has to be a power of 2. We can do interesting things. We can capture multiple events and count them. We can count occurrence for different items separately, and we can capture either event fields or actual actions. So this histogram event gives you a lot of capability to get an overview of how the system is performing by capturing things, say checkpoint counts per database. So you would slot on the database ID, and then it would keep track individually by database how many times a checkpoint had occurred, for example. The pair matching target is very, very useful. This is a case where SQL Server will keep track of matching pairs. What do we mean by matching pairs? In SQL Server, there's a lot of things that occur in pairs. You can say begin transaction, end transaction. You can acquire a lock, you can release a lock. You can require a latch, release a latch. So all of these are pairs. When the pairs match, we really don't care. All right, a lock's acquired, a lock's released. That's a good thing. That's a normal day-to-day operation in SQL Server. But let's say we have a long-running transaction. If we have a begin transaction without a matching end transaction, that can acquire and hold locks for long periods of times. So what the pair matching target does is it keeps any beginning activity, it automatically tracks events. We specify what the start event is and what the end event is. As long as there is no end event, the pair matching target will hold the start event. So for example, in the case of a long-running transaction, we could query the pair matching target to see that, hey, I have 5 transactions that have started and have not completed yet. If the transaction completes a second later and we rerun the query, that start event will disappear. So it only keeps track of the events that have not yet been completed. In 2017, we introduced the plumbing for a service broker type. These are the parameters. Unfortunately, there's no documentation on this one yet, and from what I've been able to determine, it doesn't actually perform any tasks right now. So it may be that they've started to put the plumbing in place, but just have not completed it yet, and that's why it's not documented. The ETW Classic Sync target is an interesting target in that it allows you to combine traces from SQL Server with traces from the operating system or from your application, for example. If your application has been instrumented with event tracing for Windows, you can take those files, combine them with the SQL Server XEL files, and view a complete set of events that occurred both in the application, in the OS, and in SQL Server. You must note, though, that the SQL Server startup account must be a member of the performance log users group in order to be able to write ETW files. During our next SQL Snacks, we're going to examine each target type and demonstrate how to parse the event data for that specific target type. We'll see you then. Well, thanks for listening to this SQL Snacks. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I have several email addresses and other ways to contact me listed here on the slide, and also some links to some of the projects I've shared with the community.